As the country faces one of the most important presidential elections in our history next month, the SPY thought it would be a good idea to share with our readers issues and concerns facing the ecosystem health of the Chesapeake Bay. We've been fortunate to pull together some of the most important conservation leaders on the Eastern Shore to talk about the major issues they face. And the SPY would like to welcome Isabel Hardesty, Deputy Director of ShoreRivers, Rob Etgen, President of the Eastern Shore Land Conservancy, Alan Girard, the Eastern Shore Director of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and the well-respected environmental journalist, Tom Horton. Welcome all. I'd like to start by asking each of you to assess the challenges that face your organization, and then ask Tom to provide his thoughts on the region in general. Isabel, can we start with you and ShoreRivers?
ShoreRivers works to protect and restore Eastern Shore waterways through advocacy, restoration, and education. So we work from the Sassafras down to the Choptank River in Cambridge. And leading up to this election, I'm really thinking about the Chesapeake Bay region-wide, not just the issues that are local to the Sassafras, the Chester, the Choptank, the Miles Y, and Eastern Bay. The issues that affect our local rivers are really bay-wide. We know the pollution issues happening in our waterways. We know that the excess nutrients and sediments are coming from our own actions, what we're doing on the land locally. And this is the way it is in all of the bay tributaries. You know, the Chesapeake Bay region is comprised of 6 states and the District of Columbia. You know, we have to have that strong federal oversight to make sure that everyone is doing their part to reduce pollution. We need to uphold the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. This is federal oversight to make sure that all the states are doing what they need to be doing to reduce this kind of pollution. We need to have strong federal participation in global initiatives to reduce climate change. We get a lot of nutrient pollution, nitrogen pollution from air deposition. And so climate change and fighting climate change and emissions is going to have a huge impact on the local water quality in the tributaries to the Chesapeake Bay. And then finally, we know that this is going to be really hard work to do, the work that needs to be done to clean up the Chesapeake Bay and all of our local rivers. So it's going to require some shared accountability, some teamwork, and we need a government that works to bring people together and in order to find and implement solutions.
You know, Eastern Shore Land Conservancy has been here 30 years, and we feel like we've been pretty successful pivoting our region, this part of the Eastern Shore, from really a predominantly sprawling, developed area into one where we have working lands and protected habitats and small towns. So we feel like we've made a lot of success and a lot of progress toward those goals. However, what's becoming more apparent every day, and maybe we had our head in the sand, but the rest of the world around us is not doing so hot, and these external factors are having outsized impacts on what we've been trying to do locally. So Isabel mentioned climate change. That's a key one, but also federal attention on public lands and things like that. So on climate change, I just think we do need strong federal leadership. I think walking away from the Paris Climate Accords was really devastating to our position on this issue and to progress on this issue. And I do think it's not too late. We are burning precious time, but from the folks I talked to at University of Maryland, feel like if we sort of get back on Paris and really get our ducks in a row on climate change and start working aggressively, we're not gonna do away with climate change, but the general sense is if we work hard now, we can make our worst impacts peak around 2050. And so that would be, roughly for sea level rise in our area, somewhere around 2 feet of sea level rise. That's if we get on Paris. If we don't get on Paris, from 2050 to 2100 is going to be really catastrophic. And those are just that's just the basic scientist's opinion on that, but it's fairly robust at this point. So federal leadership on climate change is really critical, and this election is just, it couldn't be more important. The other thing that's happened and occurred to us is with COVID and the quarantine, it's really become important that people have access to public lands and nature. And, we've all seen it, our parks have exploded. The use of our parks here has exploded, which is really inspiring to me to see so many people in the park. There's definitely impacts, but it's become apparent that we really need to work harder on our human infrastructure, considering parks around our towns and green belts around towns and bike trails, walking trails. All of that needs a lot of attention. I think the federal government, surprisingly, has been pretty strong over the last couple of months with the Great American Outdoors Act, which put sustainable funding behind the Land and Water Conservation Fund, the ACRES program, which funded NAWCA, North American Wetlands Conservation Act, and this new WILDS program, which provides $15 additional million for wildlife habitat in the region. So there's been some good progress, and I think, the challenge at the federal level is much of these programs are pretty laden with, for lack of a better word, bureaucracy. It's not unimportant bureaucracy, but we need to streamline those programs so they can work more effectively, particularly some farm bill programs. And our congressional delegation, it's really an agency level thing. I think at the state level, we've always had good support for program open space, and I think that's gonna be tested this coming General Assembly session because of the probably serious budget problems at the state level. So I think continuing that commitment to program open space and public lands in this state is going to be critical. I mean, we need to build a world with both clean water, but also healthy land and access to open space for our underserved communities, particularly. Folks on this call probably have access or have bikes or have cars and can get out to natural areas and have kayaks, but there's a big chunk of the Eastern Shore that just doesn't. And we need to provide open space opportunities in and around our underserved communities, and it's going to be expensive, but we really need continuing state leadership and really agency level leadership at the federal level on that.
Watershed wide, we are seeing a bay that is showing significant signs of recovery. We're also seeing that recovery is fragile. So, signs of recovery, we are looking at low oxygen dead zones in the bay over the long term, declining. Maryland Department of Natural Resources reported over July and August that the low oxygen dead zones, this is important for fish and crabs, underwater creatures that need to breathe, those levels were below average or improving. So it's a good sign that those oxygen levels are going in the right direction. Oysters are beginning to recover. We're seeing a lot of activity in oyster farming or the aquaculture markets, bringing more oysters to market, but also taking advantage of their filtering capacity to be able to clear the water and make it so that things like underwater grasses can survive. And those underwater grasses, we're seeing record numbers of those. That's because the water is getting clearer. And when we have more grasses, we have things like more crabs, because grasses are great habitat for crabs. So generally, we're seeing some signs that things are moving in the right direction. But the recovery is fragile. Back in 2018, Bay Foundation released its State of the Bay report. We put this out every couple years, been doing it for a couple decades. That report we put out, we actually dropped the score for the first time. And that is due to those extremely heavy rains. People remember that year was the wettest on record in the Mid-Atlantic region. And so we saw lots of polluted runoff entering the water, and it just underscores the need to make sure that we are filtering sources of pollution on the land. That is natural filters like trees, wetlands, grasses, meadows. All of those types of natural filters on the land are not only great wildlife habitat, but they're great for filtering runoff that's coming off hardened landscapes. And then on the hardened landscape side, our urban areas really need some help. Roads, rooftops, parking lots, particularly in Central Maryland and other areas, that really just speeds the flow of polluted runoff to nearby rivers and streams that reach the bay. And we need to be making sure we're putting in green infrastructure, things that can slow and filter that runoff from those urban areas, so that we can sustain this progress over the long term. A lot of this work is happening under what we call the Chesapeake Clean Water Blueprint. And that blueprint has a goal of having all of the practices needed for a restored bay in place by 2025. We're somewhat on track to meet that target. Some states are doing better than others, but it's important that when we get to 2025, we sustain the progress being made over the long term.
I guess for me, looking back, I'm kind of driven in a couple directions. One is that we have squeezed not all of the juice we can, but a lot of the juice out of the tech fixes, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the pipes, the smokestacks, the car exhausts. More from the Clean Air Act, sure, but pretty much it's going to come down to getting a lot more serious about land use if we are going to make much more progress on the bay, especially as population continues to increase. And that comes out in two areas. One is agriculture. Long term, I'm kind of psyched about some of this soil health initiative that I know Rob and Alan, or probably all of you, are very involved in. Big picture, if we can't figure out how to feed people, growing numbers of people, without screwing up the water, and nobody's really figured that out yet, here or anywhere else, we can't do that. That's the ball game. So there's the agricultural part. The other part is just getting truly serious about building resilience into the rest of the watershed. I'm kind of taking refuge in beavers. I'm betting on beavers, pushing that right now, and we're not going to bring back 8 million beavers, but I think we can be a lot more beaver-like. If we can't do that, well, let me just end with Dave Harp and I. Our next film is called Thinking Like a Watershed. We're ripping off Aldo Leopold's old essay, Thinking Like a Mountain, where he said you can't just look at the parts, you have to think holistically. That was very new back in the 30s. It's actually still new to a lot of decision makers now. That's unfortunate. But we're trying to show viewers how water flowed through the watershed in pristine times based on the science by Grace Brush and others, and how we can get back to some semblance of that. It was a very, very different system. Everybody knows it was greener. They don't understand how much wetter it was, how much higher the groundwater was. So those are my last thought is, to the extent that the environmental movement since Earth Day has not succeeded, and it surely has not succeeded as well as we had hoped, it's because it's had the almost impossible task of trying to put band-aids on an economic capitalist corporate system that prizes growth above all. I don't think it will ever succeed if we can't fundamentally reform that economy to something that cares more about the planet and cares less about growth.
Let me see if you all can answer that fundamental question of what should the voter be looking for? How can they impact the future of conservation and ecosystem protection in November?
There's such a important role for government, as representatives of the people and the values that people have. People want to bring their kids outside and they want to have them have access to clean air, clean water, public spaces where they can recreate. I mean, these are values that, particularly on the Eastern Shore, the people, that are raising families here really care about. And so it's important that who is elected to serve us really represents the values and the communities that sort of embody those values. And so, I think at the federal level, there's a couple things related to bay restoration in particular. One is to make sure that the Chesapeake Bay program is fully funded. This is the unit in the Environmental Protection Agency that is really the glue that is holding the whole bay restoration effort together. It's people think of EPA as a bureaucracy and an old 1950s building with thousands of people just sort of twiddling their thumbs and getting paid. This Bay program is a tight-knit group of top-notch scientists that are working to set the bar for what clean water looks like for the Bay, make sure that there are plans in place that all the states develop and adhere to, so that there's sort of a cooperative effort to make progress here, and ensure that those states are held accountable for the progress that needs to be made. It's a really important program. Interestingly, just like last week, I don't know when this will run, in early October, the House of Representatives in Congress just passed the Senate's bill that will increase Bay funding, Bay program funding to $92 million. That's record funding. We need to make sure that funding continues to ensure that the Bay restoration effort stays on track.
In terms of where to direct your vote in November, building off of what Alan said, directing it towards representatives who believe in funding conservation work and who believe in that commitment to conservation through funding. So it's the Chesapeake Bay program bill, it's the farm bill, and a lot of that comes filtered down through Maryland Department of Natural Resources. And all of that funding is hugely important to groups like ours being able to do the work that we do. And I just want to provide an example. In the past 5 years, ShoreRivers has brought in about $12.5 million for agricultural work alone. That's agricultural restoration work and research with farm partners on ag land, working with agribusiness and the ag community. And that money comes from federal programs and state programs and is directly invested in our local economy. So that money, we shouldn't be looking at it as a throwaway. Oh, how much is it going to cost to clean up the Bay? Well, yeah, it's going to cost money, but we're not throwing that money away. That money is going towards contractors, local businesses, construction workers, engineers. We've been able to hire more people on our staff because of this funding. So this is funding that's coming down from, the federal government providing that direction and that leadership in showing that commitment to this conservation funding. And it's actually providing economic support to our local communities. So voting for representatives who have that commitment to that conservation funding is hugely important.
Alan's and Isabel's comments are where the dialogue ought to be at that level of sophistication. But as we all know, the electorate is not in that kind of a serious and open dialogue going into this election. So my only experience is, back at the beginning of this year, I'm a longtime New York Times or Washington Post online reader, and I just decided I'm going to take this year and not just read those, but read Wall Street Journal, other more conservative news sources. And it has been a huge eye-opener that I'm not making judgments about whether anybody's lying or whether, any fake news or the media or anything, but I will say that there are two different worlds out there. And if to the extent that the environment is all being clustered under the D's or whatever, I think it's a disservice. And I think one thing we can all do before we go into the voting booth is just to try and look at all sides of the issue from different media outlets. It's just really difficult to dive into these issues because of the rhetoric. But if you try to digest it from multiple perspectives, I'm not suggesting that that it'll open your eyes about the environment or anything, but it'll help you understand why some people would vote for a candidate that doesn't believe in climate change. That's anathema to me. I don't understand that. I see climate change every day, but there are plenty of people out there, and there are probably people and love that do that. And so we've got to knit back. I think Isabel talked about this earlier. We have to work harder to understand the other side of the aisle as we cast our votes. It might not change our votes, but I think it'll change the process for getting there to this election and the process post-election. Whoever wins, we're going to all have to work with them, and we've got to knit this country back together so we're functioning a little bit better and having the dialogue that Isabel and Alan suggest we ought to be having.
Issues. I mean, generally, I live in expectation / fear that sprawl development is going to come back at some point. We've had kind of with the exception of that thing in Trap, at least on the shore, we've had kind of a break from rampant sprawl since 2008. And we've actually got, I think, a pretty good statewide law now, that tier law to rein in sprawl development. But we don't have an administration in the state currently that's very interested in supporting it. We almost don't have a state Department of Planning anymore. So I think we have to, I would really grill any local candidate on their commitment to protecting the open space we've got left, because I don't think we've seen the last of sprawl. I guess public access, yeah, I think we need more of that, clearly. I have talked recently with Joel Dunn at the Chesapeake Conservancy. He seems to be trying to gain traction for a Chesapeake Bay National Park, and I haven't really looked at that enough to get my head around. It sounds like a great concept, and I think just generally, you got to press candidates to follow the science. I know we don't make decisions purely on science, it's politics, but a politics that ignores the science, whether it's on oysters or land use and water quality, or BMPs on ag, or just the need for constant monitoring of water quality. Is nitrogen really getting better? Gotta press candidates on that. We've got too many who seem to just think you can ignore the science.
I guess I'm wondering about your confidence right now in the federal response to climate change, independent of the rhetoric that the president might be saying on occasion.
I think it's the Trump administration, has been walking back from climate change. And it's not just rhetoric. It has been down through the agencies, and it's not just in, there was the early on sort of guidance to not mention the word climate change, but keep doing the things that we need to do to adapt and to it and to counteract it. But grant programs such as through NOAA for its resilience grants, a lot of things have really been shut down. I mean, it's very real retreat. It's not just rhetoric on climate change, particularly, I would say. Other issues fall differently on that spectrum, but on climate change, I've seen it throughout the administration.
In any administration, I think the key is to follow the science. The laws that we have for things like clean air and clean water are, for the most part, backed by science. The Clean Water Act is founded on this idea of, for waterways that are polluted, make sure that we establish a target to get that polluted waterway off the federal or dirty waters list, and have a plan in place to ensure that work to achieve that goal can occur. Pennsylvania is a partner in the 6-state, including DC, Washington, DC, partnership to get the Bay off the federal or dirty waters list. They put together a plan that was 25% short of its nitrogen goal. They put together a plan that was $300 million short in terms of achieving its pollution reduction obligation. And so CBF and a number of partners are suing EPA to hold Pennsylvania accountable. It's a science-based standard, and EPA has the authority, the obligation really, to hold jurisdictions accountable that aren't pulling their weight. So it's that architecture and framework that I think is really key. Again, whether there's a Republican in office or a Democrat or whatever your politics are, science is key. Follow the science and the rules and regulations that are in place because of that sort of scientific foundation, and make sure that there's accountability and a way to continue to make progress on all of the values that we hold dear: clean water, clean air, lands to recreate. These laws and expectations really come from these values that we have, and the science helps us make sure that we've got a pathway to make sure those values are realized in our everyday lives.
Unfortunately, we really have gotten to the point where it's very hard to see how someone could vote Republican at the federal level and expect anything to be done positive about the environment. That's a hell of a broad statement. Unfortunately, it's about 99% true. You can find a few areas like cleaning up Superfund sites where, strangely enough, the current administration has been pretty good, but you really got to look. Climate change, if we don't change administrations to Democrat, forget about it. It's just not going to happen at the federal level, nor are we going to get the leadership Alan says we need out of the EPA and the Bay program. They're going to talk aspirational when they should be forcing Pennsylvania's hand. So it's pretty grim. I always hate to say that because it's not like the Democrats are always the gold standard. They got plenty they need to do better, but that's where we are right now.
In the big picture of climate change right now, I think it's important to look at some comparisons. So China just committed to reaching carbon neutrality by 2060, and we've got a number of major American companies who have recently committed to carbon neutrality. So Amazon aims to be carbon neutral by 2040. Microsoft, carbon negative by 2030. Starbucks, resource positive by 2030. And Unilever, carbon neutral by 2039. And these companies are seeing that consumers want this. Consumers, the American people want this. So the fact that our federal government has provided no leadership and no oversight, no inspiration, and other, we're lagging behind other countries and other businesses, and it's starting to be an embarrassment.
Because I agree, Isabel, and there are real important local impacts from those carbon neutrality statements. It's not just sort of helping global atmospheric issues. Once those companies commit to carbon neutrality, they are buying carbon credits. And we, we're trying to create a Delmarva oasis where we're protecting 50% of Delmarva by 2030. But a key driver of that is looking to be the voluntary carbon market. So a lot of the soil work that Tom referenced earlier, that companies are starting to buy carbon credits from ag soils on the Eastern Shore now. We think that market could explode, and we would have a funding source to drive regenerative soil work here in the region. Similarly, for forest protection, all of those voluntary commitments to carbon neutrality are driving, they're purchasing carbon credits, and forestry is the traditional place where we have sequestered carbon, and we have almost no credits have been sold off of Delmarva, and there's very few markets. The California market's out there, there's a few voluntary markets, but commitments like the airline industry made and the ones that Isabel cited, those are all going to be really important drivers to restoring the vitality of our land here on the shore, making it much more positive for water quality, even from ag soils, and much more regenerative for the whole planet.
I should ask if there's any other final points before we close up. I'll open up to the general group.
Just on that climate, certainly businesses can play a role, government can play an important role. And really when you're mitigating impacts from climate, the soils in our region have tremendous potential. The biological activity can really be a carbon sink and help us really reduce the impacts and the vulnerability of communities to things like stronger storms and erratic weather patterns, etc. Farming plays a critical role here. CBF is part of a group called the Million Acre Challenge. This is a collaborative that is focused on getting 1 million agricultural acres in Maryland in regenerative, healthy soil practices by 2030. And it starts with farmers' interest in profitability, which means growing a healthy crop and selling it at market for a profit, but also their interest in being good stewards of the environment. And the healthy soils principles are, make sure that you minimize disturbance, make sure that you maintain a living root in the soil, make sure that the agricultural land is covered for as many months of the year as possible. Farmers want to be good stewards of the environment, and they want to make $1 too. And if we can ensure that those principles are in place to produce healthy soil, we can meet all of those goals of profitability, good environmental stewardship, clean air and water. And I think that's really a strong opportunity going forward.
Just one issue that I'll throw out, which is almost a whole nother session, but I think there's a compelling case that we cannot meet climate goals fast enough with renewables alone, and we probably need to reconsider a new generation of nuclear power plants. Environmentalists, including me, have never wanted to touch that one, but I think we may need to. That's not just a Bay issue, of course.